The Waffle House sign buzzed softly in the stillness, its neon glow casting a sickly yellow light across the empty parking lot. Inside, the diner was a quiet cocoon of fluorescent lights and the low hum of the coffee machine. Oliver Wells leaned against the counter, idly wiping the same spot he'd been wiping for the last 5 minutes. The place was spotless, as always during the graveyard shift, when the rush of truckers and travelers on the highway slowed to a trickle. Carl, the grizzled cook, stood behind the open grill, cigarette dangling from his lips as he absent-mindedly flipped a few strips of bacon. "Slow night, huh?" Carl muttered without looking up. Oliver nodded, glancing at the clock on the wall. 11:53 p.m. 7 minutes until midnight, and not a soul had walked through the door since he'd clocked in. "Yeah, but I'll take it. Better than dealing with the drunks," Oliver said, attempting a smile. It didn't quite reach his eyes. He didn't mind the quiet, but something about tonight felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, an odd sense of stillness that made the back of his neck prickle. Carl grunted, as if to say he understood. They'd been working together for months now, and while Carl was often gruff and distant, there was a camaraderie that came from enduring the dead of night in a diner like this. Nothing ever really happened until it did. Oliver sighed, tossing the rag onto the counter and moving to refill the coffee pot. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, though he couldn't place what. Maybe it was just the endless monotony getting to him, the hours blending together until time itself seemed to drag. Or maybe it was something else entirely. The door chimed as it swung open, and Oliver froze, the coffee pot in midair. The sound was too sudden, too sharp in the silence. He glanced toward the entrance, his heart skipping a beat. A man stumbled inside, his clothes dirty, his skin pale and smeared with something dark. Blood. Oliver's grip tightened on the coffee pot handle. The man, tall, disheveled, his hair a mess of sweat and dirt, clutched his right arm, wincing with every step. He didn't look up, didn't make a sound. He just moved, as if on autopilot, toward the bathroom at the far end of the diner. Oliver's stomach turned. "Hey, you okay?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't respond. He just shoved open the bathroom door, stepped inside, and slammed it shut. Oliver stood there, staring at the closed door. The soft hiss of bacon on the grill and the faint hum of the lights were the only sounds in the room. He glanced over at Carl, who hadn't seemed to notice. The cook flipped the bacon with the same tired motion, unfazed. Something was wrong. Oliver knew it, felt it in his bones. He set the coffee pot down, wiping his hands on his apron as he walked toward the bathroom door. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. His fingers hovered over the wood, the sense of dread creeping up his spine. What if the man wasn't okay? What if he knocked? "Hey, buddy, do you need help?" No answer. Oliver knocked again, louder this time. "Hello? You good in there?" Still nothing. He swallowed hard, his hand shaking as he reached for the keys clipped to his belt. He didn't want to intrude, but something told him he had to. The man hadn't been right. His face, there was something about his face that had unsettled Oliver, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe it was the eyes. Hollow. Like they'd already seen too much. With a quick turn of the key, the bathroom door clicked open. Oliver pushed it inward, holding his breath as he stepped inside. The air was cold, colder than the rest of the diner, almost unnaturally so. He flipped the light switch, and the fluorescent bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the small, tiled room. Empty. The man was gone. Oliver blinked, his heart pounding. He stepped further into the bathroom, his eyes scanning the space. There were no windows, no other exits. Just 4 walls and a toilet. But there, on the floor near the sink, was a smear of blood. Fresh, wet. The man had been here. But where was he now? "Carl!" Oliver called out, his voice shaky. He backed out of the bathroom, stumbling slightly as he re-entered the main diner. "Carl, did you see anyone leave?" The cook barely looked up from the grill. "What are you talking about?" "The guy who just came in. He went into the bathroom, and now he's gone." Carl snorted. "Gone? You mean he left?" "No, I mean, he disappeared, Oliver snapped, his nerves fraying. He didn't come out. Carl finally glanced up, squinting in Oliver's direction. You sure you didn't just imagine it? Ain't nobody come through here in the last hour? Oliver's skin crawled. He looked at the bathroom door again, his mind racing. The man had been real, he was sure of it. The blood on the floor had been real. But if Carl hadn't seen him, then what the hell was going on? Oliver returned to his spot behind the counter, his hands trembling. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced at the clock, 12:15 a.m. Only a few minutes had passed since the man had walked in, but it felt like an eternity. He was about to chalk it up to exhaustion, to the weird tricks his mind liked to play in the dead of night, when he caught movement outside the window. His breath hitched. The man was standing there, just beyond the glass, staring at him. But it wasn't just that. It was his face. His skin was paler than before, his eyes sunken, his lips cracked and blooded. His right arm hung at an unnatural angle, like it had been broken and never set. And his eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, were locked on Oliver. For a long, terrifying moment, neither of them moved. Oliver's heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The man's gaze was like a magnet, drawing him in, keeping him frozen in place. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Oliver stumbled back from the counter, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "Carl," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heartbeat. "Carl, something's out there." The cook didn't even glance up. "You're imagining things, kid. Nobody's out there. I'm telling you, I saw him. He was standing right outside." He looked. Oliver trailed off, struggling to find the words. How could he explain what he had just seen? How could he make Carl believe him when he barely believed it himself? Carl sighed, setting down his spatula with a loud clank. "You're working too many nights. You're seeing things that ain't there. Go get some air or something." But Oliver didn't need air. He needed answers. He needed to understand how a man could walk into a locked bathroom and vanish without a trace, only to reappear outside looking like death itself. He needed to know why none of this was making any sense. He wiped his forehead, slick with cold sweat, and nodded. Maybe Carl was right. Maybe he was just losing it. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. Something was wrong, something was very, very wrong. The clock ticked past 12:30 a.m., but to Oliver, time felt broken. He couldn't focus on anything, his mind kept circling back to the man, the blood, the way he'd looked standing outside the diner like some kind of ghost. He was restocking the shelves behind the counter, trying to shake the lingering dread, when the door chimed again. His heart stopped. It was the man. Again. The same pale, disheveled figure stumbled into the diner, clutching his arm, his face contorted in pain. Just like before. Every step, every movement, was exactly the same. Oliver's mouth went dry. "No," he whispered to himself. "No, this can't be happening." But it was. The man rushed past him, headed straight for the bathroom, just as he had the first time. The door slammed shut, and Oliver stood there, frozen in disbelief. It was happening again. Oliver couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. How could this be real? How could the same thing happen twice, in the exact same way? His heart pounded in his chest as he forced himself to move. He walked to the bathroom door, his fingers shaking as he reached for the knob. He knew what he would find inside. He knew that the man wouldn't be there, but he had to see it for himself. He pushed open the door. Empty. Oliver's stomach turned. He staggered back, his head spinning. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The man had vanished again, just as before. The blood was still there, but the man, he was gone. Oliver turned, his eyes wide with fear, and looked out the window. The man was back, standing outside, staring in at him, his body more broken than before. Oliver's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to stop this. He had to end this nightmare before it got worse. He pushed open the door and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at his skin. But the moment he stepped into the parking lot, something felt off. The world around him seemed different, darker. The distant hum of the highway was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed in on all sides. The man stood a few feet away, his eyes fixed on Oliver. But this time, he didn't move. He just stood there, trembling, his lips moving silently. Oliver stepped closer, his throat dry. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's lips continued to move, but no sound came out. Then, suddenly, he spoke. "Stop it, before it's too late." Before Oliver could respond, the man's body convulsed, his limbs twisting unnaturally. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, he collapsed into a pile of dust. Oliver stumbled backward, his mind reeling. What the hell? Shaking, Oliver rushed back inside the diner, his hands fumbling for the phone. He dialed 911, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, clinical. There's something happening at the Waffle House. A man, Oliver couldn't find the words. How could he explain what he had just seen? A few minutes later, a police cruiser pulled into the parking lot. Detective Mike Lawson stepped out, his expression skeptical as he approached the diner. Oliver told him everything about the man, the blood, the disappearances. But when the detective checked the bathroom and the parking lot, there was no sign of anything. No blood, no man. Nothing. Lawson gave him a long look. "You sure you're not just seeing things, son?" Oliver shook his head, his mind racing. He wasn't crazy. He knew what he had seen. But as Lawson turned to leave, he left Oliver with one final comment. "You're not the first one to report something strange around here," Lawson said, his voice low. "If something else happens, give me a call." As the cruiser pulled away, Oliver was left standing in the diner, alone again. The clock ticked past 12:01 for the first time all night, and a wave of dread washed over him. This wasn't over. The nightmare had just begun. Oliver's hands shook as he watched the red taillights of the police cruiser disappear into the distance. He stood alone in the diner, the hum of the overhead lights suddenly oppressive, their buzz digging into his mind. He looked at the clock above the counter, 12:10 a.m. Only 10 minutes had passed since Detective Lawson had left, but it felt like hours. The world outside the diner seemed frozen, as if time had fractured into something slow and jagged. Oliver ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. He needed to get out of here. He needed to escape whatever hellish nightmare had taken over his life tonight. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the counter and bolted for the door. The cold air slapped him in the face as he stepped outside, and for a moment, he breathed a sigh of relief. But then something felt wrong. The parking lot stretched out before him, empty and silent, but it was more than that. It was too quiet. The sound of the highway that normally buzzed in the background was gone. The wind didn't rustle the trees or whisper through the grass. It was as if the world had been muted. Oliver stepped toward his car, the keys jangling in his trembling hand. He tried to focus, telling himself he'd drive far away from this place and never come back. But the moment he reached for the car door, a sensation of dread overwhelmed him. He glanced back at the diner, and that's when he saw it, the lights inside flickering wildly, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. The door chime rang again, and Oliver's heart nearly stopped. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the same man, the phantom, staggering back inside. The door swung shut behind him, the soft chime echoing in the dead silence of the night. This time, the man's face was even more distorted. His skin sagged, his eyes hollow, as if he were decaying in real time. "No," Oliver whispered, stepping back. "No, no, no, this can't be happening again." But it was. The man walked the same path as before, his body stiff and jerking, his arm hanging loosely at his side. Without looking at Oliver, he moved straight to the bathroom, just as he had the first 2 times. And just like that, the door slammed shut behind him. Oliver's legs wobbled as he backed away, his body heavy with fear. He turned toward his car again, determined to leave, but as he reached for the door handle, he found himself standing back inside the diner, behind the counter, his hand resting on the edge. "What the hell?" he muttered, stumbling away from the counter as if it had burned him. He had just been outside. He was sure of it. But now he was here, in the same spot, as if he'd never left. Oliver whipped around, his pulse pounding in his ears. Carl stood by the grill, flipping bacon in a detached, almost robotic motion. The greasy sizzle filled the silence, but something about it felt off, unnatural. Carl's back was turned to him, and for a second, Oliver hesitated, unsure if he wanted to talk to him again. "Carl," Oliver finally said, his voice strained. "Carl, did you see that?" Carl didn't respond. He didn't even turn his head. He simply stood there, his spatula moving up and down in a mechanical rhythm. Oliver approached him slowly, a deep unease creeping into his bones. The cook's movements were stiff, like a puppet on strings. "Carl!" Oliver shouted this time, slamming his hand on the counter. The sound echoed unnaturally, sharp and disorienting. Carl turned, his face devoid of emotion. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if he were staring through Oliver, not at him. "You're seeing things, kid," Carl said flatly. His voice was dull, monotone, like someone reciting a line they'd memorized long ago. "You need some rest. I just saw him walk in again. The same guy. And Carl, different. He's getting worse every time," Oliver stammered, desperation creeping into his voice. But Carl didn't react. He turned back to the grill, flipping the bacon again. "You're working too many nights. Go get some air." The words were the same, but they sounded wrong. Oliver took a step back, his stomach churning. This wasn't the Carl he knew. Something had changed. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and Carl's robotic behavior made Oliver feel like he was trapped in some twisted, distorted version of reality. It was like Carl was stuck on repeat, trapped in his own loop. Oliver's mind raced as he backed away from the counter. He needed to get out of here, but every time he tried, something pulled him back. Just as Oliver began to lose hope, the door chimed again, and this time, a different figure entered the diner. A young woman, no older than her early 20s, stepped inside, her blonde hair tousled and her eyes wide with fear. She looked around nervously, clutching her jacket tightly as if it could protect her from whatever lurked outside. Oliver blinked, his breath catching in his throat. She didn't look like a phantom, and there was no eerie aura surrounding her. She seemed real. "Can I help you?" Oliver asked, his voice shaky. The woman glanced at him, her eyes darting between him and the kitchen. I had to come. I didn't know where else to go." Oliver furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "I've been having nightmares," she said, her voice trembling. "Nightmares about this place. The Waffle House. And about him." Oliver's stomach dropped. "Him? Who?" "The man outside," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The one with the broken arm." Oliver's skin prickled as the hair on the back of his neck stood up. She had seen him too. She knew. "I don't understand," Oliver said, stepping closer. "How do you know about him?" The woman shook her head, her hands shaking. "I don't know. I've never been here before, but I've seen him in my dreams. Every night for the past week, he's been there, standing outside. Watching me." A chill ran down Oliver's spine. He felt a connection to this woman, like they were both caught in the same nightmare. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah," she said, her voice soft. "Sarah Reynolds." Oliver nodded, his mind spinning. "I'm Oliver. And I think we're in serious trouble." Before Oliver could say more, the door to the bathroom creaked open. The sound sent a jolt of fear through him, and he turned, heart pounding, as Jack, if that was still his name, staggered out. This time, his face was even more grotesque, his skin stretched tight over his skull, his eyes sunken deep into dark pits. His right arm hung by a thread, barely attached to his body. Sarah gasped, stepping back, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's him. That's the man from my dreams." Oliver swallowed hard, his body frozen in place as Jack dragged himself toward them. His movements were jerky, each step an effort, and with every step, the sound of his bones creaking and snapping echoed in the silent diner. Jack stopped just a few feet away from Oliver and Sarah, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. His mouth opened, but the words that came out were little more than a whisper. "Stop it, before it's too late." Oliver's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" Jack's hollow eyes locked onto Oliver's. "The others. They're coming." The words were barely audible, but they hit Oliver like a sledgehammer. "What others?" Jack's face twisted in pain, his body convulsing as if he were being pulled apart from the inside. His lips moved, but no more sound came out. And then, just as before, he collapsed to the floor, his body disintegrating into a pile of dust. Sarah screamed, stumbling back, her eyes wide with terror. What the hell just happened?" Oliver's mind was racing, his thoughts a chaotic blur. "I don't know," he whispered. "But I think we're about to find out." With shaky hands, Oliver rushed to the office at the back of the diner, Sarah following close behind. He needed answers, something, anything that could explain what was happening. He rifled through old newspaper clippings, files, anything the Waffle House might have kept over the years. "What are you looking for?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. "I don't know," Oliver muttered, flipping through a pile of old news articles. "There has to be something about this place. Something that explains why this is happening." After several frantic minutes, his hand froze. A headline stared back at him, bold and unignorable. "Hit-and-run accident claims 2 lives near Waffle House." Oliver's eyes scanned the article, his breath catching in his throat. "Jack Mitchell," he whispered. "That's his name. He was killed in a hit-and-run outside the diner last year." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her eyes wide. "But if he's dead?" Oliver's heart pounded as the reality of the situation settled in. "He's a ghost. He's been trying to warn us." Sarah's face paled. "Warn us about what?" Oliver looked up, his stomach twisting with dread. "About whatever's coming next." The diner felt suffocating. The air was thick with fear, and outside the window, a slow mist began creeping across the parking lot, its tendrils wrapping around the flickering neon sign. Oliver's eyes darted from Sarah to the empty parking lot, but his heart thudded painfully in his chest. Jack's words echoed in his head, "The others, they're coming." "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She gripped the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "I don't know," Oliver replied, his voice barely a whisper. He glanced at the clock. It still read 12:01. The second hand wasn't moving. Time had frozen, just like everything else. Oliver's eyes scanned the diner, searching for something, anything that could help them. But there was nothing. Just the endless hum of the overhead lights and the eerie silence pressing in on all sides. Then, from the corner of his eye, Oliver saw movement outside the window. His heart skipped a beat. He turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the fog, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved slowly, their bodies barely visible through the mist, but there was no mistaking what they were. They weren't human. "Oh God," Sarah gasped, stepping back. "They're here." Oliver grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the window. "Stay away from the glass," he hissed. "Don't let them see you." The figures stopped just outside the diner, their heads tilted slightly as if they were listening. One of them, a tall, gaunt shape, stepped closer, its eyes locking onto the window. Oliver felt the weight of its gaze, even through the glass. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. The window rattled under the pressure, a spiderweb of cracks spreading from where the figure touched. Oliver backed away, his mind racing. They had to get out. They couldn't stay here. "They're not real," Oliver muttered, trying to convince himself. "They're just shadows. Spirits." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. These things were very real. And they were coming for them. Oliver pulled Sarah toward the back of the diner, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low. "There's got to be another way out." Sarah's eyes darted toward the front door, where the shadowy figures continued to gather. "They'll see us if we leave through the front." "We're not leaving through the front," Oliver replied. "There's a back exit through the kitchen." They moved quickly, skirting around the tables and heading toward the kitchen. The shadows outside pressed closer, their hands tapping against the glass, their whispers barely audible over the sound of Oliver's pounding heart. When they reached the kitchen, Oliver shoved the door open and glanced around. The dim light flickered overhead, casting strange shadows across the tiled floor. He moved toward the back door, but the moment his hand touched the knob, he felt an electric jolt shoot up his arm. He yanked his hand back, wincing. "What the?" he muttered, trying the knob again. This time, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had fused with the frame, sealed shut by some unseen force. "It's not opening," Oliver said, panic rising in his voice. Sarah's eyes widened. "What do you mean it's not opening?" "It's a door. It's locked," Oliver snapped, pulling harder. "I can't explain it. Something's keeping it closed." The rattling at the front of the diner grew louder, more insistent. The figures outside were becoming more aggressive. Oliver could hear the low murmurs of their voices, like a twisted symphony of whispers. They were getting closer, and the diner was growing darker by the second. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, Oliver thought he saw one of the figures standing in the kitchen with them, a shadowy silhouette that vanished as soon as the light stabilized. Sarah took a step back, her breath quickening. "We're trapped, aren't we?" Oliver didn't want to admit it, but the truth was undeniable. The diner had become a prison, a supernatural trap that was pulling them deeper into whatever nightmare Jack had warned them about. Sarah stumbled back from the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. She gripped the edge of the counter as if to steady herself, but her legs were shaking. I can't breathe," she whispered, gasping for air. Oliver turned to her, alarmed. "Sarah, what's wrong?" Before he could reach her, Sarah collapsed to the floor, her hands clutching her head as if she were trying to block out some horrible noise. Her body trembled, and her eyes rolled back into her head, her voice rising in a desperate, strangled cry. "Sarah!" Oliver shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Sarah, wake up. What's happening?" But she didn't respond. Her body went rigid, her eyes unfocused, and then, as if something had taken control of her, she spoke in a voice that wasn't her own. "They all died here. They all return." Oliver froze, his blood turning to ice. What are you talking about?" Sarah's voice was strange, distant. "The highway is cursed. It's always been cursed. Everyone who dies here is drawn back. They can't escape. Not until the truth is revealed." "What truth?" Oliver asked, his voice shaking. "What are you talking about?" But Sarah's body convulsed again, and the vision seemed to pass. She slumped forward, her breathing shallow and uneven. Oliver held her, his mind spinning. Cursed. Drawn back. None of this made sense. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, and she stared up at him, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "Oliver, I saw something. In my head. I don't know how, but I saw it." Oliver swallowed hard. "What did you see?" "I saw the accident," she whispered. "I saw what happened the night Jack died. But there was more. There was someone else there. Someone watching from the shadows. And whatever it is, it's still here. Controlling everything." Oliver's heart raced. He remembered Jack's warning, the others. But now, Sarah was seeing even more. The shadowy figures, the looping time, the whispers, it all pointed to something far darker than just restless spirits. Something powerful, something ancient was pulling the strings. Oliver helped Sarah to her feet, his mind still reeling from what she had just said. This place is a trap," he muttered, pacing the small kitchen. "It's not just Jack, it's all of them. Every soul that dies here gets pulled back, stuck in some kind of loop." "But why?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "Why us? Why now?" "I don't know," Oliver replied, his frustration growing. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. "Maybe it has something to do with the accident. Maybe Jack's death triggered something." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "I saw the accident in my vision. It wasn't just Jack. There was someone else. I couldn't see their face, but they were there, standing in the shadows, watching everything." Oliver's stomach twisted. Someone else? Another person involved in the accident? But who? And why were they still haunting this place? Before he could ask more, The rattling at the front of the diner grew louder, more frantic. The shadowy figures outside were pressing against the windows now, their glowing eyes fixed on the interior of the diner. The glass was starting to buckle under the pressure, and cracks spread across the surface like spiderwebs. "We can't stay here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "They're going to get in." Oliver's mind raced, trying to think of a plan. The front door was blocked, the back door wouldn't open, and the windows were about to shatter. They were out of options. Unless... "The storage room," Oliver said suddenly, grabbing Sarah's arm. "There's a storage room in the back. It's small, but it's locked from the inside. We can barricade ourselves in there." Sarah hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Okay. Let's go." They bolted for the storage room, skirting past the kitchen and moving quickly toward the back of the diner. The sound of shattering glass echoed behind them, and Oliver didn't dare look back as the shadowy figures flooded into the diner, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Oliver slammed the storage room door shut behind them, locking it tight. He and Sarah leaned against the wall, both of them breathing heavily, their hearts racing in unison. "What now?" Sarah asked, her voice small and frightened. Oliver didn't answer right away. He was still processing everything that had happened, the revelations about Jack, the curse, the shadowy figures. But one thing kept nagging at him, the accident. He remembered Jack's warning, remembered Sarah's vision. There was something important about that night, something they were missing. And then it hit him. The truth he had been avoiding. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling. I think I know why we're stuck here." Sarah's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "Why?" Oliver swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Because I was in the accident, too. I think I died that night." Sarah stared at him, her mouth opening in shock. "What are you saying?" Oliver's voice shook as the realization fully sank in. "We're dead, Sarah. We've been dead this whole time. This diner, this night, it's a limbo. We're trapped here, reliving the same nightmare over and over." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. No, that can't be. I can't be dead." But deep down, Oliver knew it was the truth. He had died in the same accident that killed Jack. They had both been pulled into this twisted loop, unable to move on, unable to escape. And the shadowy figures outside. They were the others' lost souls, just like them, forever trapped on this cursed stretch of highway. "We have to find a way to break the cycle," Oliver said, his voice hoarse. "Or we're never getting out of here." The small, cramped storage room was a suffocating cocoon of fear and silence. The walls seemed to close in, and the dim light from a single overhead bulb cast long shadows on the shelves stacked with supplies. Oliver leaned against the door, his heart heavy with the weight of the revelation. He was dead. Sarah was dead. They were both trapped here, along with the other lost souls that haunted the diner and the highway. Sarah sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, her face pale and streaked with tears. "This can't be real," she whispered, shaking her head. I don't remember dying." Oliver's voice was low, almost hollow, as he spoke. "Neither do I. But it's the only thing that makes sense. Everything we've seen, everything that's happened tonight, it all points to this. We're caught in some kind of loop, reliving the moment of our deaths over and over again." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide and desperate. "But why? Why us? What did we do to deserve this?" Oliver shook his head, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know. Maybe it's not about what we did. Maybe it's about what happened here, on this highway, in this diner. Something is keeping us here, something bigger than just us." He could hear the faint whispers of the shadowy figures outside, their voices seeping through the walls like a cold breeze. They weren't just spirits, they were echoes of something far darker, a force that held them all captive in this endless nightmare. "We need to understand what's holding us here," Oliver said quietly, his mind racing. "If we can figure out what's behind all of this, maybe we can break the cycle." Sarah wiped her eyes, taking a deep, shaky breath. "But how? How do we find out what's going on when everything is so twisted?" Oliver thought back to the visions Sarah had experienced, the cryptic warnings from Jack, and the cursed nature of the highway. There was something connecting all of it, something they had missed. "We need to talk to Carl," Oliver said, his voice steady with determination. "He's been acting strange all night. I think he knows more than he's letting on." The air was thick with tension as Oliver and Sarah left the storage room and made their way back into the main diner. The shadowy figures had receded, for now, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. The broken glass from the windows crunched under their feet as they cautiously approached the counter, where Carl was still standing behind the grill, his back to them. "Carl," Oliver called, his voice firm but wary. Carl didn't move, didn't turn around. His back remained hunched, his hands methodically flipping pancakes that no one had ordered. The smell of burning batter filled the air. Oliver stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Carl, we need answers. What's going on here? What do you know about this place?" Carl's shoulders tensed, but he still didn't turn around. Instead, his voice came out low, almost mechanical. "It's not what you think, kid. It's worse." Oliver exchanged a glance with Sarah, who stood frozen beside him. "Worse? What do you mean?" Slowly, Carl turned to face them, his eyes dark and hollow, like the life had been drained from him long ago. He looked older, more worn than Oliver had ever seen him. "You think you're stuck here because of some accident? Some hit and run. But this diner, this highway, they've been cursed long before you two ever showed up." A chill ran down Oliver's spine. "Cursed? How?" Carl's eyes narrowed, his lips twisting into a grimace. "This place, this whole stretch of road, it's a feeding ground. For something old. Something that feeds on the souls of the lost. People like you, like me, like Jack. We're drawn here, trapped here, because it wants us to be." Sarah's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth. What are you talking about? What is it?" Carl shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his throat. "I don't know what it is. A demon, a curse, a force older than time, hell, maybe it's the highway itself. But whatever it is, it keeps us here. Keeps us running in circles, reliving our deaths, feeding off our despair." Oliver's heart pounded. The idea that something was actively keeping them here, feeding on their pain, was horrifying. But it also made sense. It explained the time loop, the shadowy figures, and the sense of helplessness that had hung over him all night. "So, how do we stop it?" Oliver asked, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. "How do we break the curse?" Carl's gaze flickered, and for a moment, a flicker of something like hope crossed his face. "You can't. Not unless you face it. Not unless you confront whatever's controlling this place." The diner's lights flickered violently as Carl's words sank in. The hum of electricity was joined by a rising, ghostly wail like the cries of the damned emanating from outside. The shadows were coming back, and they weren't going to stop this time. Oliver's stomach churned as a sense of impending doom settled over him. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Face it. You mean, the thing that's been watching us? Controlling us?" Carl nodded solemnly. "It's more than just shadows and ghosts. It's a force. It wants to keep you trapped. It feeds off the fear of never being able to escape. That's why you keep seeing Jack, why you're stuck in this loop." Oliver's fists clenched. He refused to be a prisoner to this nightmare any longer. "We have to find a way to get out. We have to fight back." Carl shook his head sadly. "It's not that simple, kid. It never is." But Oliver wasn't listening. His mind was already racing, trying to piece together what little he knew. This curse, whatever it was, wanted them to stay. It wanted them trapped in a cycle of fear and confusion. But if they could break the loop, if they could find a way to escape its grip, they might be able to weaken its power. "Maybe it's the diner," Oliver muttered, half to himself. "Maybe this place is the key. If we can destroy it, maybe we can destroy the thing controlling it." Carl's eyes widened in alarm. "You're crazy. That'll only make it stronger." But Oliver wasn't so sure. The diner was the epicenter of the curse. If they could break free of it, maybe they could break the curse itself. Suddenly, the lights flickered out, plunging the diner into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, Oliver's breath quickened. He couldn't see a thing, but he could feel the oppressive presence of the shadows closing in around him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the air felt thick with dread. He reached out, grabbing Sarah's hand as they backed toward the counter. A low rumble shook the floor, followed by a deep, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Whatever was controlling the diner, it was angry. "We have to go," Oliver said urgently, pulling Sarah toward the back of the diner. "We need to get out of here, now." But just as they reached the kitchen, the ground shook again, harder this time, knocking them off balance. Sarah stumbled, her grip on Oliver's hand slipping as she fell to the floor. "Sarah!" Oliver shouted, reaching for her. But before he could help her up, the shadows surged forward, enveloping her in darkness. Her scream echoed through the diner as she was pulled into the black void. "No!" Oliver yelled, rushing forward. But it was too late. Sarah was gone, swallowed by the curse. Carl stood motionless by the grill, his face pale and expressionless. "There's no saving her now. She's part of it." Oliver's mind raced with panic, but something inside him hardened. He couldn't let this thing win. He couldn't let it take them all. With a surge of determination, Oliver bolted toward the storage room again, where he'd seen a small gas canister for the grill. He grabbed it, unscrewing the lid, and began dousing the diner in gasoline. "What the hell are you doing?" Carl demanded, his voice shaky for the first time. "Ending this," Oliver said, his hands trembling but resolute. "If we destroy this place, maybe it won't have any more power over us." The shadows writhed and screamed as Oliver lit a match, the small flame flickering in the suffocating darkness. His heart pounded in his chest as he stared down at the gasoline-soaked floor, the weight of the moment pressing on him. Carl stepped forward, his voice a mixture of anger and fear. "You're going to burn us all alive." Oliver's hand hovered over the floor, his grip on the match tightening. "Maybe that's what it takes. Maybe that's the only way to break free." Carl's eyes darkened. "You're a fool." Before Oliver could drop the match, the ground trembled again, and the diner seemed to warp around him. The walls bent and twisted, the lights flickered in and out, and the air itself felt wrong, heavy, oppressive, like a living thing pressing in on him from all sides. And then, in the blink of an eye, Oliver was no longer in the diner. He was back on the highway, standing in the middle of the road, staring at the oncoming headlights of a truck speeding toward him. His breath caught in his throat as the truck barreled closer, the memory of his death flashing before his eyes. This was it, the moment he had died, the moment he had been trapped in this endless loop. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't powerless. With a surge of defiance, Oliver stepped out of the truck's path, breaking the cycle that had held him captive for so long. Oliver's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood in the middle of the highway, the roar of the truck fading into the distance behind him. The wind was cold against his skin, and the stretch of road ahead was empty, a black ribbon cutting through an endless night. For a brief moment, everything was still. He wasn't dead. Not yet. He had broken the cycle, stepped out of the loop. But the victory felt hollow, incomplete. Something still lingered in the air, an oppressive force waiting to pull him back in. The diner loomed behind him, its lights flickering in the distance. Shadows danced across the cracked pavement of the parking lot, and Oliver could feel the pull. The curse wasn't done with him. It still wanted him trapped. It still needed his soul. From the diner came a sound, a low, guttural growl that made Oliver's skin crawl. He knew what it was. The entity. The source of the curse. It was waiting for him. He had only one choice now. Oliver squared his shoulders and turned back toward the diner. The shadows whispered as he approached, their voices growing louder, more frantic, as if they knew what was coming. The glass in the windows was cracked and splintered, and the door hung open, creaking in the wind. Inside, the darkness waited, thick and impenetrable. Oliver's heart pounded as he crossed the threshold. The air inside was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on him from all sides. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a storm. And then he saw it, the source. It stood at the far end of the diner, a monstrous figure wreathed in shadow. Its form was vaguely human, but distorted, stretched in ways that made no sense. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. "So, you think you've escaped?" the entity hissed, its voice like nails scraping against glass. You think you can break free from me? Oliver stood his ground, his fists clenched. I'm done playing your game. The entity's grin widened, and it took a slow, deliberate step toward him. You've only just begun. I feed on fear, on pain, on the endless suffering of those who wander this cursed road. You are mine, Oliver. You always have been. The shadows writhed around the entity, twisting and contorting as if they were alive. Oliver's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had broken the loop once. He could do it again. But first, he had to face whatever this thing was and destroy it. You're not invincible, Oliver said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. You can be beaten. The entity laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the diner. You think you can defeat me? You are nothing but a broken soul, a flicker of life that has already been extinguished. You cannot fight the inevitable. Oliver's mind raced. He knew he couldn't take this thing on physically, it wasn't something that could be fought with fists or fire. But if it fed on fear, on the pain of those trapped here, maybe there was another way. Maybe the key to defeating it wasn't in fighting, but in denying it what it craved. He took a step forward, his heart racing. You've been feeding on me for too long, Oliver said, his voice firm. But I'm not afraid of you anymore. The entity's eyes narrowed, the shadows around it churning with anger. Lies, it spat. You cannot escape fear. You cannot escape me. But Oliver didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his gaze locked on the creature. I've been afraid of dying, of being trapped here forever. But I'm done with that. I know the truth now. I know I'm already dead, and that's the worst you can do to me. You can't hold me here anymore. The entity shrieked, its form twisting in the shadows. You cannot defy me. You will suffer for eternity, just like the others. No, Oliver said softly, his voice filled with a calm resolve. I won't. The diner shuddered, the walls groaning as the entity's power faltered. Oliver could feel it weakening, its hold on the diner and on him slipping. But the fight wasn't over yet. Images began to flash before his eyes, memories of the accident, the night that had trapped him here. He saw the highway again, the blinding headlights of the truck, the screeching tires as it swerved out of control. He felt the impact, the sudden, violent jolt that had ended his life. But there was something else, something he hadn't noticed before. In the darkness, standing at the edge of the road, there had been another figure. A shadowy silhouette, watching from the distance. Watching him die. The same figure he had seen in the diner. The source of the curse. You were there, Oliver whispered, his voice filled with a sudden clarity. You caused the accident. The entity snarled, its form flickering in the shadows. I am everywhere. I am the force that binds this place, the keeper of souls that wander this cursed stretch of road. Your death was inevitable. You belonged to me the moment you set foot here. Oliver's jaw clenched. The entity had been orchestrating everything, pulling the strings, causing the accidents, feeding on the souls of the lost. But now, he understood. It wasn't invincible. It wasn't some all-powerful force. It thrived on fear, on control. And he wasn't going to let it control him anymore. You're not a keeper, Oliver said, his voice growing stronger. You're a parasite. The entity roared, lunging at him, its shadowy tendrils reaching out to ensnare him. But Oliver stood his ground, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to swallow him whole. He had seen the truth. He had faced death. And now, he was ready to face whatever came next. With a final surge of willpower, Oliver reached deep inside himself, tapping into the last remnants of his strength. The entity's tendrils wrapped around him, cold and suffocating, but he didn't falter. He held on to the truth, the knowledge that this thing only had power if he let it. I'm not afraid of you anymore, Oliver said, his voice echoing through the diner. And in that moment, the shadows recoiled. The entity's form began to flicker, its power unraveling as Oliver's defiance broke through the curse. The diner trembled, the walls cracking as the force that had held it together for so long began to crumble. The shadows dissolved into nothingness, and the entity let out a final, ear-piercing scream before vanishing into the void. The silence that followed was deafening. Oliver stood in the middle of the diner, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The oppressive weight that had hung over the place was gone, lifted like a veil that had finally been torn away. The air felt lighter, freer. He glanced around. The diner was still there, but it felt different now. The lights were steady, the flickering gone. The shadows that had once loomed so menacingly were nowhere to be seen. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind, her warnings, her visions. She had seen it too. The curse was tied to the highway, to this place. And now, it was broken. Oliver took a deep breath, his hands trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. He had done it. He had faced the thing that had kept them all trapped here, and he had won. But Sarah was gone. And so was Jack. The shadows had taken them, consumed them before Oliver could break the cycle. His heart ached with the weight of their loss, but he knew there was nothing he could do now. They had been victims of the curse, just like he had been. But now, they were free. They could move on. Just like he could. Oliver stepped outside the diner, the cool morning air brushing against his skin. The sun was just beginning to rise on the horizon, casting the highway in a soft, golden light. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world felt alive again. The mist that had once clung to the road was gone, burned away by the warmth of the sun. The diner stood quiet behind him, no longer the haunted prison it had been for so long. The curse had been lifted. He turned to look down the highway, the stretch of road that had once seemed so ominous now just a normal road. Cars passed by in the distance, their headlights fading as the day began to break. Life was moving on, just as it always had. And now, so could he. Oliver took one last look at the diner before turning away. He didn't know where he was going, but it didn't matter. The fear that had gripped him for so long was gone. He was free. As he walked down the highway, the weight of his past lifted with each step. The shadows were gone, the loop broken. And for the first time since his death, Oliver felt truly alive.